On today's episode of What's Going On with Shipping, we talk about Maersk Lines and the U.S. Tanker Security Program. Hi, I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. All right, I am going to weave you a tangled web and try to explain a story that has been developing over the past week that I've been studying. It is complicated, and I apologize if I lose anybody in this story, but I want to take a moment and break it down because I think it is really indicative of issues with global shipping, U.S. defense policy, and how the United States hopes to be able to field a merchant marine to support the Department of Defense should it ever need it, especially in the Pacific. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. So this is a post I put on my LinkedIn page the other day. It seems that Maersk Lines Limited is not interested in soliciting and working with the United States Department of Defense much longer. They will keep their maritime security program contracts with the Maritime Administration and Transcom, but they are spinning U.S. Marine Management, USMMI, off as a separate company. AP Moller Maersk, which is the parent company for Maersk Lines Limited. Maersk Lines Limited, I should mention, is the U.S. Subsidiary of Maersk Lines, is being overtaken by MSC Mediterranean and CMA CGM in terms of ships. That's true. Maersk was once number one. Now we see them falling to number three. It ended its partnership with IBM over the TradeLens system. This has a lot to do with cryptocurrency and also data sharing. And now they have adopted green methanol as their interim fuel source. All true. Add to that, Maersk is cutting much of their Danish crews, and they are passing on reflagging tankers into the new tanker security program. And then I had to get a little bit literary here. Something smells rotten, or something is rotten in the state of Denmark. So that obviously initiated some conversations, not the least of which is like, Sal, how do you know that Maersk is selling to USMMI? Because I kind of broke that story a little bit early. So I got a warning. I got Google alerts like crazy, and one of them came in from the American Maritime Officers, the AMO union. AMO on September 22nd posted this story. AMO agreements remain in force after the sale of the USMMI fleet. So unusually a union spills the bag on what is going on. The story was that Maersk was selling off USMMI, which is their operating company, for ships that they go get contracts for from the Military Sealift Command. Military Sealift Command is the commercial arm of the U.S. Navy. This is the group that mans the Navy oilers and auxiliary vessels, but they also get private companies to operate vessels, for example, pre-positioning ships and survey vessels. So USMMI has been a subset of Maersk Lines Limited, and they have been getting these government contracts for quite a while. But now you get this story is that AMO is going to continue its ties with USMMI as the company is spun off, which raises the question is, why is the company spinning off? Why is Maersk divesting themselves of USMMI? And it goes to this story done. It was actually an editorial back in January by Steve Carmel. And Steve Carmel is with Maersk Lines. And he wrote this piece. It was in G Captain and over at SIMSEC, the Center for Center for International Maritime Security. U.S. Navy needs tankers, a crisis in capability. All right, I've been talking about this for freaking ever, that we don't have enough commercial ships. And in this case, Steve Carmel looked at it specifically regarding tankers. The fact that we are under the amount of tankers. Basically, there's a requirement here for about 86 tankers, and we are woefully short of this. You'll see that if you add up government-owned tankers, long-term charters, voluntary tanker agreements, military useful tankers engaged in domestic trade, and tankers even without military utility, we only come to 66 tankers. So we are well short of the 86 tankers we need. And Steve spelled this out, and this has led to the creation of a program that aims to bring tankers back under the U.S. flag. And that is the Tanker Security Program. This has been a brainchild of the U.S. Transportation Command and former leaders over in the CNO's office, John Kaskin, who used to be over at N42. A lot of them have been proposing this idea of what's called a Tanker Security Program. Let's pay commercial firms to bring ships back into the U.S. registry. And we give them basically, some will say it's a subsidy, some will say it's a differential. we give them money. We give them money, about $6 million per ship, to reflag vessels in. So this was authorized. A 10-ship program was authorized under a Department of Defense budget. And so 10 ships were authorized. And what we saw was 9 ships come in. So 3 of them came in from Crowley lines in an agreement with Stena Tankers. So you get the Stena Immaculate, Stena Imperative, and the Stena Impeccable. So those are 3. And then Overseas Shipping Group also brought in ships. So the OSG fleet brought in 3 of their vessels. And then the last one we saw come in was Seabulk. Seabulk brought in 3 of their vessels. So what you had was 9 vessels came in, but there was no 10th vessel, and suspiciously missing from this list was Maersk Lines. Maersk Lines, which is mainly container ships, has a offshoot of theirs, Maersk Tankers. And there are several Maersk tankers that are on the contract to the U.S. government, not the least of which is Maersk Perry, which is an ice-rated tanker that's used for the resupply of McMurdo Station. But it was very obvious to many people that tankers, 9 out of 10 tankers were awarded, and Maersk was missing from this. Now, the Tanker Security Program emulates what's called the Maritime Security Program. Back in 1996-97, at the end of the Persian Gulf War, we realized that there was a big shortfall in the U.S. flag commercial fleet. One of the things that happened back in the 80s is the U.S. stopped giving differential subsidies for the construction and operation of ships in international trade. And that led to the big clear out. All of a sudden, when U.S. companies weren't getting differential subsidies, they left. They reflagged their vessels to Panama, Liberia, the Marshall Islands. They fired their American crews and hired Filipinos and Indians and Chinese and Russians. And it created lower operating costs because you don't have to pay as much. Minimum wage on an international going ship today is about $22, $23 a day, not minimum wage for a U.S. mariner. And this had huge implications in the ability to sustain the force that was sent to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait in 1990-91. So DOD realized their mistake. And instead, what we saw was the creation of this, the Maritime Security Program. The problem with the MSP is this. This creates an operating differential. It doesn't create a construction differential. They failed to bring in a construction differential, which means while we're getting reflagged vessels into the U.S. fleet, we're not building any U.S. ships. But that's a different story. We'll talk about that later. And the biggest operator under this program is Maersk Lines. Now, initially, Maersk had problems with this. It was initially under Sealand, which was a U.S. company, but Maersk bought Sealand, and for a brief period of time, it was Maersk Sealand. And Maersk Sealand had a problem because Maersk is a foreign company. But the DOD, the Department of Defense, determined that it's okay to have a foreign-owned company do it as long as there was an American subsidiary. So they created these subsidiaries. So Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, CMA CGM, through APL, create American subsidiaries, and they operate them. And so Maersk basically rotates older vessels into the U.S. registry. They can't be older than 25 years, and they operate. And these ships are seamlessly integrated into the Maersk transportation system. You'll see them here, Maersk Atlanta, Chicago, Columbus. This is an older chart. They have not updated this chart since 2021, I believe. So some of the ships have changed out. So Maersk has this big, huge network. They're using this big network to transport goods. They integrate it into their system. And let's be clear, Maersk has a worldwide system for containers. Back when I worked at Military Sea Lift Command and we were doing our intervention into Somalia in 1991-92, and the U.S. Navy had no port information on East Africa, I knew that if I called Maersk, a company I worked with through the Maritime Prepositioning Program, they would have that information. And sure enough, they gave us port surveys and port informations for Mogadishu, for Mombasa, all up and down the East Africa coast, because they are a massive network, Maersk Lines, one of the biggest shipping companies in the world. They have been the biggest shipping company for a long time. The problem is now they're creating a tanker security program with 10 ships, 9 so far, but eventually want to go up to 20. The problem is tankers don't work like container ships, and that is a fundamental flaw that the Department of Defense does not understand. Containers work on moving dry cargo, obviously, But, there is a set amount of containers. Yes, we see dips and troughs in the amount of goods that are shipping around the ocean today. We're in that trough period right now. But there is a set level that we're moving. You're always going to be moving goods. You're always going to be doing that. Oil is completely different. Oil comes from different places. It goes different places. You're chasing loads around the world. And lots of times tankers don't have consistent business. They're always chasing after a load. Sometimes they're sitting on a load waiting to sell. And so the tanker market operates a lot different. Just because you hand out a $5 to $6 million subsidy to a tanker, that doesn't mean it is good to go and is safe to operate, as opposed to a Maersk Line's container ship, which is woven into a bigger system. Back in the 70s and 80s, we had big oil tanker companies like you do today with container liners. They were known as the Seven Sisters. This is Mobil, Exxon, BP, Shell, but they're gone. They're gone in terms of fleet operations because of Exxon Valdez and Amoco Cadiz. And now you have basically operating companies that serve as buffers between the oil companies and their receivers. And oil tanker companies are not as big anymore. They're not as big as and robust. And so the tanker market is substantially different than the dry market. The other element you have here is we're seeing a consolidation in the U.S. tanker fleet. Two stories came out not too long ago. This story in early September, Crowley and SEACOR to combine their Jones Act tank vessel fleet. They're creating what's called Fairwater Holdings. So they're bringing together a fleet of 20 what are called ATBs, articulated tugs and barges. That's this. This part here is a huge barge. And then in the notch here is a tugboat. The idea was you would be able to move these components, drop off the barge, and then pick up another one and move them. In truth, the whole reason for this is cost. Because you have to crew a tugboat vice a tanker, it's less personnel. This is the whole reason for ATBs. And then also 11 tankers under long-term charter. So really interesting. All of a sudden we saw Crowley and SEACOR putting their tanker fleet together, but that wasn't the only one. In August, we had seen this new entity come on the scenes called Maritime Partners. Now, Maritime Partners is a firm out in the southern part of the United States. They tout a big, huge footprint of ships, but most of them were tugs and barges. They really weren't a deep draft operator. But they came on and acquired a Jones Act fleet. Specifically, what they did is they came in and bought up shares of what is called the American Tanker Holding Company, which is a subsidiary of AMSC. This is an Oslo-based company. And so they came in and started procuring these vessels, largely the ones that were under long-term charter to Overseas Shipping and Keystone Shipping. So OSG and Keystone were operating tankers. And now here comes Maritime Partners, and they acquire them. So the Jones Act fleet was being divvied up between Maritime Partners and Fairweather Holdings. And that was the entity. And then that story comes out about USMMI, that USMMI was being spun off as a separate company and it was being sold. I was pretty sure it was Maritime Partners that was buying it. And because of a couple of reasons, we saw this story back in May. Maritime Partners announced groundbreaking $235.3 million securitization. In other words, they have basically secured that amount of money over a 7-year loan, 7-year term with a 7.167% coupon. So they're expecting to make profits here. They came in with the idea that they're going to make profits. And this is a company that had its eyes fixed. And procuring the vessels from OSG and Keystone wasn't going to be enough. And that's what we know for sure, because on 26 September, this story was released finally. Fund managed by Maritime Partners acquire U.S. Marine Management. So here's the confirmation we were waiting for. They announced this. They're acquiring MMI. They're going to be engaged in chartering U.S. flag tanker and military support vessels owned and operated by USMMI to the Military Sealift Command. MMI currently operates a fleet of 5 U.S. flag vessels, including 1 owned maritime support vessel, 3 owned tankers, and 1 bareboat tanker. So almost all tankers. Now, MMI, for a long time, also operated the LMSRs. These are the large, medium-speed roll-on, roll-off ships in the reserve fleet. But they no longer did. And that was a interesting issue for me because they had just been awarded a contract to operate those vessels early last year. It goes on that they have recently awarded a new operating agreement with the U.S. Maritime Industries Tanker Security Agreement, and they're bringing a tanker online. It goes on here talking about the company. We're excited to add USMMI to our portfolio. Bick Brooks, co-founder and CEO of Maritime Partners. USMMI's long-term contracts with a strong customer base will nicely complement our existing portfolio. Goes down here, Maritime Partners managed a fleet of approximately 1,850 vessels, which is impressive, but it's also very small tugs and barges. We offer tailored leasing services, privately held company founded in 2015. So great to have them in here. But the question goes, why would Maersk, which has operated USMMI for a long time, spin off that company separately? And there was a lot of issues going on here. So my buddy John Conrad over at GCAP, it's obvious is that Maersk was looking to cement their ties closer with China. China is a huge exporter and exports vast amount of cargo, not just to the United States, but to Europe and around the world. And Maersk does a lot of business in China. John went further and talks away why Maersk is backing away from the U.S. military contracts. I had that same question in my opening LinkedIn page. Why are they backing away from this? Are they worried about this? Is there concern about what happens should the U.S. and China get into the war? Now, Maersk is a Danish-held company. It represents a good chunk of the Danish GDP. Denmark is a NATO nation. But again, these operating companies have gotten very detached from their nationalities. These are international companies that operate in this. And so John talked about issues about shipbuilding, which is a major factor. A lot of ships for Maersk are being built in East Asia, including in China. Talked about the complicated nature of that we just kind of discussed here over this. And then he had some questions that remains. First, if war breaks out and these tankers are asked to respond, will Maritime Partners be able to provide the full support of a giant global company like Maersk? Go back to my scenario, East Africa. Maersk is a monster when it comes to global footprint. It has places everywhere. And you lose something by losing Maersk lines. Let's be clear about this. You lose something by losing Maersk lines. Second question, will the administration meet with allied shipbuilders, large shipping companies like Maersk, to find mutually beneficial agreements? You know, CEO of Maersk goes to China. He really needs to come to the U.S., meet not just with President Biden, but with Secretary of Transportation Buttigieg, with the Department of Defense. What is going on here? And that's where we get to the final part of this. So right from the very beginning, the tanker security program is in jeopardy, I would argue, because there are two competing issues going on here. Number one, you have the fundamental flaw of the tanker business, which is you're chasing after loads all the time. And the system is up and down, up and down. If you've seen my talk I did with Jay Mintzmeyer on the tanker sector, you know what's going on in tankers. And if you follow me with tankers in the Black Sea, you know how convoluted that whole trade is. But then you add something like the closing of the Red Hill facility. Just did my video on 6 oilers, early World War II naval logistics. And when you remove 6 million barrels of Department of Defense fuel from Hawaii, that means you're 6 million barrels short of providing fuel for the entire Pacific fleet. It's gone. How do you offset that? And the tanker security program isn't meant to offset that. It's meant to provide the filling of places like Red Hill and MSC oilers, going back to the United States, loading up with oil and bringing it out to the fleet. But the U.S. has initiated a series of charters to offset the closing of Red Hill. They're chartering tankers like crazy for 1 year, or in this case, 2 90-day charters. And let's be clear about a couple of things here. The 1-year charters are meant to put a fraction of the Red Hill fuel in dispersed areas around the Pacific. They are not chartering 6 million barrels of tankers. They're, again, maybe a quarter of it they're looking to charter. That's probably going to be about the most they can. But these 90-day charters are really important because the reason they're doing these, I would argue, is to find jobs for these tankers that are in the TSP because of the fluctuation in the tanker market. But it goes back to the fundamental flaw here, which is the U.S. government through Transcom, the Transportation Command, is using the Maritime Administration in part of their solicitation for contracts. And the Maritime Administration has included in their contracts, these were not in the DoD contracts, but these are in the Maritime Administration contracts, what is called Section 2 of the Merchant Marine Act of 1916. It is now codified as Section 802 of specifically 46 U.S. Code, Chapter 23, the Shipping Act. So the Shipping Act of 1916, something I know extremely well because I've written papers about these, has these provisions in here, and they talk about three aspects: corporation, partnership, or association, a citizen. So ownership of controlling interests. With the meaning of this chapter, no corporation, partnership, or association shall be deemed a citizen of the United States unless the controlling interest therein is owned by citizens of the United States, and in the case of a corporation, unless its chief executive officer, by whatever title, and the chairman of the board of directors are citizens of the U.S. Because under the Tanker Security Program, you have to meet Section 2 of the Shipping Act of 1916. And since Maersk Lines is a Danish corporation with a non-U.S. citizen CEO and head of the board of directors, that ruled them out from being involved in the TSP, even more so when the contracts to operate the LMSRs, those reserve large medium speed railroads that went from MSC over to MARAD. There was this belief that we need to consolidate surge shipping all under MARAD. Those contracts were deemed to be Section 2 applicable. So MMI had been the operator for those vessels for years. They no longer could bid on those contracts. And so MMI found themselves in a position where they would not be able to bid on TSP contracts. They could bid on these 1 year and 90-day DoD contracts to store oil for the Red Hill facility, but they couldn't be part of the Tanker Security Program. And this is what led USMMI and Maersk Lines Limited and Maersk to cut MMI off of it, sell it to Maritime Partners, which is a wholly owned U.S. company, and operate it. This is confusing, I know, and I apologize for the very long story here, but it goes to a couple of issues. Number one, the international nature of shipping. International shipping is owned by multiple corporations, and there's always going to be across transnational lines. It's really hard to do that. There are really very few U.S. shipping firms left. We got rid of them. U.S. Lines went bankrupt in the 80s. American President's Line was sold out. It's now APL, but it's owned by CMA CGM. Likes Lines went away. Sealand went to Maersk. Very few U.S. companies remain that are wholly American from top down. And we see that playing out here. But on the flip side of that, when you lose your connection to Maersk, then you lose that international footprint that Maersk Line has. Now, I talked with Maersk Lines. Believe it or not, Maersk Lines called me when I posted my information. So I actually talked to a shipping line. So I talked to Maersk Lines. And what they told me is that, listen, the MSP ships, those cargo ships, those container ships are staying. They're not getting rid of those. They are staying because they're under a contract where Section 2 does not apply. It's not in there because those are DoD, Department of Defense. It's the Department of Transportation contracts, so the TSP contracts, that are creating the problem. And so I think, again, this is an issue I've had, and I got into a little bit of a fight on Twitter with someone about this, about why we're not going to get 20 ships in the TSP program. Because number one, there's not business enough for them. Unless there's cargo preference, unless there is a requirement to haul cargo on U.S. flag vessels, unless we sit there and say so much oil and diesel fuel that goes overseas has to be hauled on U.S. ships, you're not going to be able to keep ships in the TSP. You're just not. Unless you give them full contracts to operate for the Department of Defense. So either we're paying them money to be U.S. flagged, and then we're paying them for their daily operation use, or you're not going to have them. You're not going to be able to maintain 20 ships in the Tanker Security Program. And that, my friends, is a substantial issue. We are keep talking about increasing our commercial footprint in terms of a merchant marine, but I think some of the people making the policies don't quite understand the complexity of the rules they're imposing on shipping companies to do this. If you want US only companies to do it, that's great. That's fine. But understand what you're going to get. You're going to have to do something to set those companies up. And we saw that with USMMI being sold off to Maritime Partners. Now, will Maritime Partners emerge as the big tanker firm? Maybe. You don't know. I don't know. But this is the situation we're in right now. But you are not going to push to a 20 ship TSP fleet, Tanker Security Program fleet, until you iron out what cargo they're hauling and that there's cargo available. Because let me be clear, no commercial firm has a ship just to have a ship. They do it to make money. And if they ain't friggin' making money, they ain't having the ship. They'll lay it up in a second, sell it, scrap it. It's doing them no money. I hope you enjoyed today's video. It's a long one, I know, and very complicated, but hopefully I cleared it up for you. If you did like today's video, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, give it a big thumbs up, and if you can, support the page. How can you do it? Well, you can help support the TSP by becoming an American oil company. No, I'm kidding. You can support the page by either hitting that super thanks button down below or head on over to Patreon and become a patron of the page, either monthly or yearly. I get my videos available to my patrons as early as I can, sometimes a few days before they're released on the main channel. I ask them for suggestions, for story ideas, and more importantly, I'm available to them to answer any questions they have. Until our next video, this is Sal, signing off.